There are disasters that do not begin with thunder, with signs of a storm, or by falling from the sky. They begin in places no one can see, in the human heart. A city can glow with golden light, overflow with crowds, and pulse with the sounds of life. Yet deep inside, it may have been dead for a very long time. Imagine a place where people no longer feel guilty for doing what is wrong. A place where the weak are trampled, the poor are forgotten, and arrogance is praised as a kind of strength. A place where the richer people become, the more they believe they do not need the truth. And when someone rises to speak about truth, they are not heard, they are mocked. That is not an imaginary story. That was Nineveh, one of the mightiest cities to ever exist. It was a thriving center of trade, where every road seemed to lead to money, power, and status. But what made that city truly terrifying was not its strength. It was the emptiness inside the souls of the people living there. And in that very place, one man stood up. No army, no power, no backing, just one message repeated over and over, day after day. He did not promise wealth. He did not bring miracles to persuade them. He spoke only of one thing they did not want to hear. Return to the one true Creator. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. If stories like this touch something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel and walk with us, because some stories are not meant to be heard only once. They are meant to change the way you see the world and the way you see yourself. That man was Yunus. He walked through noisy marketplaces, where people were busy buying and selling, but no longer cared about right and wrong. He knocked on door after door, speaking to them about a truth they had forgotten long ago. He reminded them that there is one who sees everything, that this life is not all there is, and that wealth cannot save them from the consequences of their own actions. But the more he spoke, the more he realized a painful truth. It was not that they did not understand. They understood. They just did not want to change. The people in power laughed at him. The wealthy saw him as a threat. Ordinary people chose silence because they did not want to stand against the crowd. And over time, that silence became a wall, so thick that no words could break through it. 1 year passed, then 10 years, then 20 years, and in the end, 33 years. 33 years is not a moment, it is an entire lifetime. 33 years standing in the middle of a crowd and still being alone. 33 years speaking about light to people who had grown used to living in darkness. 33 years of hoping, then disappointment, then hoping again. And after all of that, only 2 people believed him. Pause for a moment and think about that. Not 200, not 20, just 2, in a city of hundreds of thousands, after more than 3 decades of effort. The result was only 2 changed hearts. If it were you, would you keep going, or would you give up? There is a truth people rarely speak out loud. The most persistent people are not always the strongest. They are simply the ones who have not collapsed yet, until the day they do. And sometimes, what breaks them is not failure itself, but the length of it. Yunus was not weak. He endured more than most of us can even imagine. But even the strongest heart has its limits. And the most frightening thing is not when someone gives up at the beginning. It is when they give up right before everything changes. At that time, Nineveh was still living in false prosperity. Its streets were still crowded. Its markets were still loud. Its idols were still being worshipped. But no one realized that a storm was forming, not in the sky, but in their destiny. Because some collapses do not happen all at once. They build, quietly, little by little, until there is no way back. And while the whole city was still asleep in its pride, a decision was slowly taking shape in the heart of Yunus. A decision that would change not only his fate, but the fate of an entire people. But what he did not know was this. His real test had not even begun. There is something very few people realize. Human beings do not collapse because of a single blow. They collapse because of tiny cracks, repeating over and over, silently building up until the heart can no longer bear the weight. Patience is not an endless condition. It has limits too. And when those limits are reached, even the strongest people can make a decision they will later have to pay for. Yunus had reached that line. After 33 years, he was no longer facing the fierce rejection he had met in the beginning. What remained was a cold silence. People did not argue with him anymore. They did not try to refute him. They simply ignored him. And sometimes being ignored hurts more than being opposed, because it says this: your words are not even important enough to be heard. Then a final warning was given. not from Yunus, but from Allah himself, a fixed period of time, 40 days, not long but not short either, long enough for one person to rethink everything, long enough for a community to change, but also long enough to reveal who they really were. Yunus brought that message to his people, not with anger, but with hope. Maybe this would be the last time they listened. Maybe when faced with real danger, their hearts would soften. Maybe what he had been saying for 33 years would finally mean something. But what came back to him was still the same old indifference. The first day passed, nothing changed. The 10th day, the city was still the same. The 20th day, not one sign of repentance. And then, the sky began to change. It was not an instant storm, it was a slow, heavy shift. Thick clouds began gathering, as if some invisible force were pulling them in from every direction. The light began to fade, the air grew suffocating. An unexplainable feeling began creeping into people's hearts, as if something was coming closer, but no one wanted to name it. Yunus saw it. He understood better than anyone. This was no longer a warning. This was a sign. But what caused him pain was not the anger gathering in the sky. It was the indifference of the people beneath it. They still lived as if nothing was happening. Still trading. Still laughing. Still worshipping statues that could not hear and could not see. As if they were trying to prove they were not afraid. Or worse, as if they truly did not believe. Time kept moving. 25 days. 30 days. Each day felt like another weight being laid on the heart of Yunus. Not because he feared the punishment was coming, but because he knew it was coming, and no one was preparing for it. Then on the 37th day, something inside him broke. Not his faith. His faith had never wavered. What broke was his endurance, his ability to keep standing there, speaking words no one heard, watching people move closer and closer to an end they could not even see. 3 days left. Only 3 days. For someone who had waited 33 years, 3 days should not have been too much. But this is where the paradox appears. Sometimes the shortest stretch is the hardest one to cross. When you are close to the finish line, all the exhaustion you have been carrying becomes heavier than ever. Yunus looked up at the darkened sky. He looked at the city still sinking in carelessness. And in that moment, he believed everything was over, that nothing could change now, that punishment was unavoidable. And then a thought appeared, quiet but strong enough to become action. He had to leave, not because he was afraid, but because he did not want to witness what was coming. A heart that had tried to save others for 33 years could not bear to watch them be destroyed. This is the most delicate point in the story, because from the outside, that decision seems reasonable. Anyone would think the same way. When every sign points to a certain ending, leaving seems like the natural choice. But inside that reason, there was still something incomplete. Yunus did not wait until the full time Allah had set was over. That was not rebellion. It was not a sin. It was a very small misjudgment. But sometimes, the smallest misjudgments open the door to the greatest tests. That night, no one noticed when he left the city. There was no farewell. No one tried to stop him. There was only darkness and the sound of heavy footsteps. Behind him was a city that still had not awakened. Ahead of him was a road he did not even know the destination of. But what Yunus could not see at that moment was this. His story was not over. It was only beginning. The sea at night is unlike any place on earth. It has no clear boundary, no solid point to hold onto. Only endless darkness, stretching so far that a person feels frighteningly small. And that was where Yunus stepped, not knowing he was moving toward an entirely different test. One that no longer had to do with other people, but with facing himself directly. At first, the ship he boarded carried a sense of peace. The wind was light. The water was calm, as if everything were opening a road away from the past behind him. The captain recognized him and welcomed him with respect. In their eyes, Yunus was still an upright man, a trustworthy man, and perhaps in that moment, Yunus himself believed that he had left behind one heavy chapter and was stepping into something lighter. But some journeys do not let human beings walk away that easily. Not long after the ship left shore, the sky began to change. Not suddenly, but through a pressure that slowly tightened around the space itself. The wind grew stronger little by little. The waves, which had only been ripples at first, rose higher, heavier, more violent. The ship began to shake. The wooden boards groaned under the force of water and wind. Then the storm truly arrived. These were no longer ordinary waves. They were towering walls of water slamming into the ship as if trying to tear it apart. The wind screamed, hitting with such force that it seemed it could snap the mast in half. Water rushed into the vessel. The people on board could no longer stay calm. They were no longer seasoned sailors. They had become human beings clinging to life. In moments like that, people begin searching for a cause. Not a scientific cause, but a cause tied to destiny. They believed this storm was not random. Someone on the ship had brought something with them that was not right. A misfortune, a wrongness. And if the ship was going to be saved, that person had to be removed. So they decided to cast lots. It seemed like a simple act, but it carried the weight of life and death. One name would be chosen, and that person would have to leave the ship, not by stepping off, but by being thrown into the sea. The first time, the name that appeared was Yunus. A silence spread across the ship. No one wanted to believe it. They knew him. They trusted him. A man like that could not be the cause of disaster. They thought there must be some mistake. So they decided to try again. The second time, still Yunus. The air began to grow heavy. Eyes met each other, full of doubt, but also full of fear. The third time, still Yunus. At that point, no one could call it coincidence anymore. And when they tried once more, as if searching for one final escape, the result did not change. Yunus. There are moments when people understand they no longer have a choice. Not because they are weak, but because every other road has already been closed. The people on the ship looked at him, not with hatred, but with pain. They did not want to do this. But they also could not let everyone go down with the ship. And what made that moment so different was Yunus' response. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not try to save his own life with words. He simply accepted it in silence. There was a very unusual calm in the way he walked toward the edge of the ship. It was not the calm of someone who did not understand what was happening. It was the acceptance of someone who realized he was stepping into something already decreed. The wind was still screaming. The waves were still rising. Darkness was swallowing everything around them. And then Yunus fell. There was no cry for help, no desperate thrashing. Only a body pulled down into the deep sea where no one could survive. The water was freezing. Pressure crushed in from every side. There was no light, no direction, nothing to hold onto. In that moment, everything that had once belonged to him, identity, mission, past, all of it became meaningless before the power of the ocean. But that was not the end. From the deep darkness below, something moved. A gigantic creature rose from the heart of the sea, so large that even the ocean seemed smaller beside it. Its mouth opened like a living abyss, and Yunus was swallowed whole. If the sea is where human beings lose control, then inside the fish is where they lose everything else. No space, no time, no connection left with the outside world. This was no longer a test of the body. This was total stripping away to prepare for something far deeper. Something Yunus had never experienced before, and it was the very thing that would change him forever. There are places not meant for human beings to live in, but to face themselves in. No light, no sound, no familiar sign of life. Only a silence so dense that every thought becomes clearer than ever before. Yunus was in such a place. Darkness covered him, but it was not just one kind of darkness. It was layered, heavy, and absolute. The darkness of the night above, where no star could break through. The darkness of the ocean, where light could not reach. And the darkness inside the creature that swallowed him, where everything was completely cut off from the outer world. 3 layers of darkness, sealed shut without a single opening. In a situation like that, the natural human response is panic, to try to escape, to cry out, to ask, why me? But Yunus did not do that. Not because he was not afraid, but because in that moment, he realized something deeper than fear. He had nothing left to hold on to. No ship, no people, no means of rescue, no cause that could help him. Everything that once served as support had disappeared. And when everything disappears, only one thing remains. Allah. That was the moment when faith was no longer theory, no longer something spoken with the lips. It became the only reality still left, and out of that silence, words were spoken. Not an ordinary plea, not save me, not get me out of here, but an admission, a return. There is no God but you. You are perfect beyond all flaw, and I am the one who has wronged myself. That was not the speech of a man looking for a way out of hardship. That was the speech of a man who had understood the deepest truth. when he no longer asked anything from the world and turned only toward the one who created it. A very subtle change took place in that moment. Not outside. The darkness was still there. The space was still tight. The situation still had no visible escape. But inside Yunus, something shifted. Fear was no longer at the center. The presence of Allah became the center. And when that happened, the situation no longer carried the same meaning. What had once driven him into despair became the place where he was most deeply connected to his faith. At the same time, far away in another place, something was shifting there as well. The city that had once drowned in arrogance began to feel what it had refused for so many years. The sky was no longer a vague sign. It had become a clear warning. The air was heavy. The color of the world itself seemed darker. A feeling of dread spread everywhere, and it could no longer be ignored. And for the first time, they were afraid. Not afraid because of the words of Yunus, but afraid because they were beginning to see the consequences of refusing to listen to him. The two people who had believed him, the only two in 33 years, now became guides. They had no power, no social standing, but they possessed what the whole city lacked: understanding. They told the people there was still a way, not a way of escape, but a way back. But that path was not easy. It was not just a matter of saying sorry. It demanded real change. And then something remarkable happened. A city that had rejected truth for decades now turned back to it together. Not one person at a time, an entire community. They began to believe, not because they were forced, but because they had seen the truth. But that faith did not stop at words. They began to make things right. What they had taken from others, they returned. The injustices of the past, they tried to repair. The things they once clung to, wealth and power, no longer came first. They gave. They let go. They left the city, as if trying to separate themselves from the people they used to be. And then they stood beneath the sky, no longer proud, no longer confident in themselves. What remained was weakness and hope. And they prayed, at the same moment, in two different places, in two completely different conditions. Both were turning toward the same one. One man in the absolute darkness of the sea. One community beneath the heavy sky of coming punishment. And in that moment, something beyond all ordinary rules took place. Both prayers were accepted. This was not coincidence. This was convergence. Human beings at two opposite ends of circumstance, one in absolute loneliness, the other in collective terror, turning back to one single point. Allah did not look at where they stood. He did not look at the circumstances around them. He looked at what was in their hearts. And when the heart truly returns, everything can change. In the darkness, Yunus no longer felt trapped the way he had before. The place that once felt like a prison began to feel different. Not because the space had changed, but because the way he saw it had changed. And on land, a city that had once stood on the edge of destruction began to be pulled back. And it all began with one thing: a true return. Not every journey ends in victory the way people imagine. Some victories do not happen on a battlefield, are not witnessed by a crowd, and come with no applause or recognition. They happen in silence, in the deep transformation of the heart, where no one sees. But everything changes. When Yunus was brought out of the darkness, he did not emerge like a conquering hero. There was no glory, no display of strength. His body was weak, exhausted by everything he had gone through. His skin had become thin and sensitive, as if life itself had turned fragile. He lay there on an empty stretch of land, under an open sky that had once felt familiar, but now felt strangely distant. This is a very different image from what people usually expect. Not a blazing miracle, but a slow recovery, full of care. A plant grew beside him. Its broad leaves gave him shade. Its fruit nourished him. It was not random. It was a precise and gentle arrangement. When human beings are at their weakest, they do not need grand things. They need enough shelter, enough nourishment, at exactly the right moment. That is how mercy works. Not loudly, not dramatically, but exactly. Yunus was no longer the man who had once left the city. He no longer saw the world the old way. Before, he had looked at the actions of people. He had looked at whether they believed or refused to believe. He had looked at the results of his long years of effort. But now, he had seen something deeper. He had seen what happens when every cause disappears, when there are no people left to lean on, no circumstances left to control, nothing at all left to hold on to. Only Allah remains. And and in that state, he understood that everything he once thought of as a cause was really just a layer covering the truth. The one truly moving all things had always been beyond anything human beings could grasp. While Yunus was recovering in the place that had once been his city, a change unlike anything before was taking place. The people who once mocked him were no longer the same, not because they had been forced to change, but because they had seen the consequence of their old path, and they chose another road. They did not return to their old habits. They did not return to arrogance. They did not return to the way of life that had once blinded them. What makes this story so different is that their change was real. It was not a moment of fear followed by forgetfulness. It was lasting transformation. And when Yunus returned, he did not come back to a hostile crowd. He returned to people waiting for him, not to argue, not to resist, but to be guided. There is one small detail here that carries deep meaning. The one who helped Yunus when he was at his weakest was not forgotten. Gratitude was not treated as a passing emotion. It became action. The person was given a place, trusted, and honored. This shows a truth many people overlook. What we do in our smallest moments can shape our future place in ways we do not see. Not because people repay every good deed, but because Allah misses nothing. It may seem as though the story ends here. One man is saved. One community is forgiven. A hopeful ending. But if we see it only that way, then we miss the most important part. Because this story is not really about one man or one city. It is about a law of life. There will be times in life when you feel trapped. No way out. No one understands. Nothing is working the way you hoped it would. You may have tried for a very long time. You may have done everything right. But the result still has not come. That is when you start to think the problem is your circumstances. But maybe the problem is the way you are seeing those circumstances. Yunus was not saved when he tried to force his way out. He was saved when he let go of every effort to control the situation and returned to the one thing that never changes. And the people of Nineveh were not forgiven when they merely said words of repentance. They were forgiven when they truly changed, in action and in the way they lived. And that leads to a question every person must ask. If you are in your own darkness right now, what will you do? Will you keep trying to control what is outside your reach? Or will you return to what you have forgotten for so long? The story of Yunus does not belong only to the past. It is repeating every day, in different forms and in different lives. Every person has their own sea, the upheavals they cannot predict. Every person has their own darkness, their fears and doubts. And every person has their own fish, the thing slowly swallowing them from the inside. But just like Yunus, there is always a way out, not from the outside, but from within. The deepest lesson in this story is not simply keep going. It is keep going until the very end. Yunus remained steadfast for 33 years, but by leaving just 3 days too early, he stepped into a trial he never expected. In modern life, many people are also living through their own 37th day. They have tried long enough to feel exhausted, long enough to begin doubting, long enough to think nothing will ever change. And it is exactly at that point that they decide to stop, not realizing they may be standing right in front of their greatest turning point. This story reminds us that sometimes what we need is not a new strategy, but a little more patience, a little more time to wait for what has not happened yet. But at the same time, this story teaches that when you fall into darkness, the answer is not to control your circumstances. It is to return and take hold of your inner self. The doer of Yunus was not simply a plea to escape hardship. It was a renewed awareness of his place in the universe. When you can admit your limits, when you stop blaming, when you return to true humility, that is when everything begins to change, even if the outside situation has not changed yet. If you feel this story is not just a story, but a mirror reflecting your own life, then join the Prophetic History Explained community, so we can keep exploring more stories with this kind of depth, not only to understand history, but to understand ourselves, to learn how to face hardship, and to discover real meaning in things that once seemed meaningless. And if you want us to keep bringing you content that can touch your heart and change the way you see the world, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support the channel. Because every subscription is not just support. It is also the motivation that allows stronger stories, deeper stories, to keep being told.